Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short.
Brilliant. So thanks for those who just joined us. Matt was just mentioning, do feel free to pop any questions in as we go through this evening. The format will be that I'll kind of share myth busting on anxiety and the most recent research evidence for the first kind of 20 minutes or so. And then we'll have a Q&A, so if you've got any specific questions about the content that I cover, you'd be welcome to ask those during that time. So just to introduce myself, my name is Chloe Chessell and I'm a PhD researcher and psychological wellbeing practitioner based at the University of Reading. And over the past couple of years, I've been working particularly to support parents of children with anxiety disorders. And so I'm here this evening to do a presentation on myth-busting anxiety, particularly focusing on children and adolescents. So I guess the first myth that I wanted to bust this evening is that all children grow out of anxiety. But before I do that, I just first of all wanted to ensure we all have a shared understanding of what anxiety is. So anxiety is a normal emotion. We all experience anxiety from time to time, and experiencing anxiety can be helpful in some situations. So, for example, if you're crossing a busy road, it can be helpful to have a little bit of anxiety there to keep us safe. But anxiety becomes problematic or reaches disordered level when it starts to really interfere with our ability to do day-to-day activities. And so in children or adolescents, we might see anxiety impacting in their schoolwork, for example. So they might really struggle to participate in class because of their worries, or they might struggle to go to school at all. We might also see impacts in terms of hobbies or friendships. So young people might be really struggling to go to hobbies or spend time with friends because of their worries. And we also commonly see sleep as affected as well. So children or adolescents might struggle to get to sleep, might be waking up lots in the night worrying, or waking up early in the morning kind of consumed with worries. And anxiety disorders are these kind of chronic, severe, and really interfering levels of anxiety. And anxiety disorders are the most prevalent mental health disorder in children and young people. So it's the most commonly diagnosed mental health disorder. And recent research suggests that around 6.5% of children and adolescents worldwide meet diagnostic criteria for an anxiety disorder. And so do children grow out of anxiety disorders? While research suggests that around 15 to 20% of children will naturally recover from their anxiety disorder, that actually means there's a large proportion of children who continue to experience these really interfering levels of anxiety without appropriate treatment and support. So the next myth that I wanted to go through this evening is kind of opposite to the other one, really. So people tend to fall into one camp or the other. And it's the idea that children will have anxiety forever and that anxiety can't be cured. And we know that's a myth because we know there are effective psychological treatments for children with anxiety disorders. So cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, is the recommended psychological treatment for children and adolescents with anxiety disorders. And for those of you that might be less familiar with CBT, CBT is based on the idea that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours are all interconnected. And when we're experiencing an anxiety disorder, we might have particular ways of thinking or behaving that are maintaining that difficulty and keeping that anxiety going. And so what cognitive behavioural therapy aims to do is to give children and young people tools and techniques to start to behave differently, so to start to gradually face their fears, so that they can learn new information about their fears and their ability to cope in these feared situations. And we know that cognitive behavioural therapy is an effective treatment. So cognitive behavioural therapy has been shown to be more effective than not receiving any treatment at all. We don't know how well cognitive behavioural therapy compares to other psychological treatments. And that's because research hasn't sufficiently examined other psychological treatments. And so what we can say at the moment is that we know that there's the strongest evidence base for cognitive behavioural therapy, and it is an effective treatment. And I've popped a little screenshot there of one of a recent paper published in 2020 by James and colleagues who've done a review of CBT for children and adolescents with anxiety disorders. And I'll make sure there's some links posted with the slides at the end, so that you have the recent research evidence if you're particularly interested in any of the studies I discussed. So we know that cognitive behavioural therapy is effective then, but which parts of cognitive behavioural therapy are the ones that kind of make the difference or help children to overcome their difficulties with anxiety? And so CBT then has different components. So again, for those who might be less familiar, cognitive behavioural therapy might include information on what anxiety is. It might include perhaps tools and techniques around thoughts and challenging thoughts or identifying thoughts. It often includes techniques around exposure, so facing fears, and also sometimes relaxation as well. But at the moment, there's not been much research which has kind of tried to disentangle which are the core parts of treatment that are really making a difference in helping young people to overcome their anxiety. But from the research which is starting to emerge in this area, what we can see is that its exposure or facing fears seems to be particularly key. And exposure has been shown to bring about faster rates of change than other treatment components like relaxation techniques. And relaxation techniques have also been shown to be associated with poorer treatment outcomes. So it really does seem to be exposure that is key in helping children and adolescents to overcome anxiety. And our understanding as well of how to maximise exposure and get the most benefits from exposure has also started to kind of change in the research. So before, we used to encourage children to stay in a situation that is anxiety provoking until their anxiety naturally reduces. And it's a bit like an analogy of if you jumped into a swimming pool. It feels very cold at first, but the longer you stay in that situation, your body kind of adjusts. And it was the same idea really with anxiety. But research is now suggesting that exposure might be more effective, or we can maximise exposure if we simply view it as encouraging children to learn new information about their fears and their ability to cope. So to really see exposure is all about learning. So learning what does happen if we go into these anxiety-provoking situations. Does my fear come true? If it does, is it as bad as what I thought it might be? Or can I cope better than what I thought I might? So there started to be that kind of shift in the literature there. So the next myth is that often perhaps parents or teachers or those that work with children might think that they can't help a child who is experiencing anxiety. And that's often a common concern. I've worked with lots of parents who might feel a bit helpless. They don't know what's best to help their child. They're feeling that they don't have the tools to help their child. But we know that parents and teachers and adults in children's lives are in a really powerful position to be able to support children to overcome their anxiety. And there's actually been a whole pool of research which has looked at what we call parent-led cognitive behavioural therapy. And so that's where a parent and a therapist work together. So the child doesn't attend those treatment sessions, and the therapist helps the parent to learn tools and techniques that they can apply at home to help their child to overcome their difficulties with anxiety. And parent-led cognitive behavioural therapy approaches have been shown to result in good outcomes for children with anxiety disorders, and have also been shown to result in equivalent outcomes compared to treatments that involve both parents and children, and can be achieved in less time as well. So we know that parents and teachers are in a really powerful position to support children, and hopefully this evening I'll be able to give you some top tools and tips on how you might be able to support a child who is experiencing anxiety. But before I do that, another common myth is that it won't be effective for parents to support their child if they also experience anxiety themselves. And this again is kind of a common concern among sort of therapists or parents or other people who are working with children. And we do know that anxiety does run in families to an extent. So if you're supporting a child who's anxious, it might well be that their parents are experiencing an anxiety disorder as well. But that doesn't mean parents aren't in a good position to still be able to support their child. And one research study that was conducted a few years ago now and published in 2015 by the University of Reading examined whether parents who also had anxiety were able to support their child who was experiencing anxiety. And they compared two different treatments. They compared our standard parent cognitive behavioural therapy and another version which had a couple of extra techniques really to help parents to tolerate their child's distress. And what the results showed were that actually there were no differences in treatment outcomes. So children did equally well in both treatment conditions, which showed us that actually parents who are anxious as well are still in a really powerful position to be able to support their child with anxiety. So we know then parents, teachers, those in the child's network are in a powerful position to help them to overcome their anxiety. But how? How can parents and teachers and those that work with children do that? And before I talk about this a bit more, I'm just going to launch, I'm going to see if, Charlotte, can you launch my next poll for me, please? So hopefully you should have a poll appearing on your screen, which asks you whether you think talking about worry makes worry worse. So let me know if you think that's a myth, a fact, or perhaps not quite sure. So just give you 30 seconds or so, and then Charlotte, if you're able to close the poll for me after that, would be great, thank you. Okay, so most people have clocked on that maybe it's a myth. Super. Yeah, so we do know that actually it's a myth that talking about worry makes worry worse. But sometimes it can be a bit daunting as a parent or a carer or a teacher to know how to talk to children about anxiety. And so I've got some top tips really for how to talk to children about anxiety. And often when we're talking about worry or talking about anxiety, how we ask the question is just as important, or if not more important, as what we ask. So we really encourage those that work with children, or if you have a child who's anxious, to ask really open, curious questions. So to ask things like, what is it that's making you worried? Or why are you feeling worried in this situation? So really curious, open tone. We then want to make sure the child feels heard and understood. So it can be really helpful to empathise with the child. So to say things like, well, that sounds really hard for you, or it sounds like you've been really worrying about that. And then again, to ensure that the child feels understood, it can be helpful to summarise back to them what they've told you. So you've told me that you're really worried about answering questions in class because you're worried that people might laugh at you. Have I understood that right? So it's really all about being open, curious, and trying to be empathetic to the child's difficulties. So it can feel unnatural or a bit odd to use this kind of style of questioning at first. So sometimes it can be helpful to practice with another adult. Sometimes when I work with parents or teachers, they might worry that a child might not want to talk to them about their anxiety. They might say lots of things, oh, I don't know what I'm worried about. And in that case, it can be helpful to make suggestions. So you can suggest things you think they might be worried about, or sometimes what works better is to suggest something you know completely they're not worried about, because often children and adolescents like to tell us that we've got it wrong, and it gives them an opportunity to say, no, that's not what I'm worried about. Actually, I'm worried about this. It can also be helpful to consider when you're asking a child or young person about worry. So really think about picking your moment. So sometimes children respond well to kind of sitting down one-on-one and talking about their worries, whereas other times parents tell me that children respond better if the attention is a bit less focused on them. So for example, if you're driving in the car or you're taking a dog for a walk. And particularly with younger children, it can be helpful to try and incorporate their hobbies or interests, so to try and make the conversation a bit more fun. Sometimes parents and teachers or those that work with children might then kind of feel they've used their open questions, they've figured out what the child's anxious about, and they then don't know what to do next. And it's our natural instinct as adults to want to kind of take that worry away, or tell a young person not to worry about that, or solve the problem for them. But actually it can be really powerful just for a young person to be listened to and heard. And then it can be helpful to move on to another activity, something fun or distracting, to try and contain that worry for the young person. Or perhaps even think together about how you might help them to overcome that worry, which we'll speak a bit more about now. So I've got my next poll, if that's okay, Charlotte, which asks whether you think it's a myth or a fact that it's helpful for children to avoid situations that make them anxious. So again, just give you a few moments to vote if you'd like to. Okay, super. Okay, brilliant. So most people thinking that it's a myth. And again, yes, it's our next myth of the evening. So it can be helpful, or children experience relief in the short term if they avoid a situation. They don't have to face that fear. But actually, if we avoid a situation, it keeps the anxiety going in the longer run. It means that children don't have an opportunity to learn what happens if they do go into that anxiety-provoking situation. Does their fear come true? Is it as bad as what they thought it was going to be? Can they cope better than what they thought? So it's important that we encourage children to face their fears, but this needs to be done in a way that's helpful for the child. So we don't want to kind of throw them in the deep end and see if they kind of sink or swim. We want to really create these opportunities for children to learn new information about their fears and their ability to cope in these feared situations. And that's often done in a gradual, step-by-step way, where you identify kind of an ultimate goal that the child would like to work towards, and really breaking that down into more manageable, less anxiety-provoking steps that are going to help the child to build confidence and to learn new information about their fears along the way. And so on the next few slides, I'm going to talk through a couple of examples of how we might do this with a young person, and what we call these are step-by-step plans. So we've got an example here of a young person who might be fearful of answering questions in class. And so their ultimate goal is to answer an unprepared question in front of the whole class. But that might be quite anxiety-provoking if we just kind of encourage them to go out and do that. And so we can work with the young person to break this down into a series of smaller, more manageable steps that allow them to learn new information about their fears and their ability to cope, and to build confidence in doing this. So the first step, for example, might be to answer a pre-prepared question in front of 1 or 2 students, working their way up to an unprepared question in front of a small group of students, and then up to an unprepared question in front of the whole class. And as I mentioned earlier, in really to kind of maximise these steps and these exposures, it's all about these opportunities for learning. And so to maximise that, what we can do is use the curious questions that I went through on the couple of slides before, to ask the young person before they have a go at the step, what do they think is going to happen? So that we have a prediction from them as to what they expect is going to happen when they answer a pre-prepared question in front of 1 or 2 students. And then afterwards, to help them to maximise their learning, again, we want to use these curious, open questions to ask them, what did happen? Did your fear come true? If it did, was it as bad as what you thought? Were you able to cope in that situation? So really reviewing with them what they've learned from doing that anxiety-provoking situation, what they learned about their fear and their ability to cope. And that's really important to help young people to really maximise their learning. And it's important that when you review that with the young person, that we're remaining really curious and open. So we want to try and avoid saying things like, oh, see, I told you you didn't need to worry about that. I knew that wasn't going to happen. So we want to be really open and curious so that we're not passing judgment on the young person's fears or worries. So I've got another example here of a young person who's got lots of worries about spiders. And again, the ultimate goal here is for them to be able to go to sleep when there's a spider in the room. And we've broken that down into a series of more manageable steps. So starting with the easiest step, which might just be looking at a picture of a spider, then working up to viewing a video of a spider, being in the same room as a small spider, and so on. Again, in order to maximise our exposure and get the most out of these tasks, we want to use our open, curious questions beforehand. So what do you think is going to happen if we look at a picture of a spider, and to get a prediction from the young person? And then to review afterwards, what happened when you did that? What did you learn? How did you cope? So again, those really curious questions to help promote learning. And so typically these step-by-step plans would have between 5 and 10 steps in them to make them manageable for a young person. And they can be flexible. So it might be that you have to add a few extra steps in as you go along, because maybe one step seems too big. So for example, step 3 here, to be in the same room as a small spider for 10 minutes might just seem a bit too big. And so you can think with the young person about how you can break that down into perhaps 2 smaller steps that are still working towards that goal. Also as well, it can be helpful to perhaps have a reward for each of the steps to help motivate a young person to face their fears. Because we know it's really challenging to face our fears. It can be really scary. And those rewards don't have to be big or monetary. They can be things like spending time with parents, or perhaps a sticker for their sticker chart, or staying up for an extra 10 minutes on the weekend, whatever it might be helpful to motivate that young person to have a go at facing their fears. So I've got some key points about the step-by-step plans that I've just gone through, just for you to kind of take away with you really. The first one is to involve a child in creating that step plan. The more that children are involved in having ownership and helping with the decision making, the more they're going to feel in control and perhaps feel less overwhelmed at the thought of starting to face their fears. Use the curious open questions before and after each step to really maximise the child's learning. And try to make the plan fun and engaging wherever you can. So it might be that the young person wants to print off the plan and decorate it or put their favourite stickers on, or even making the steps fun and engaging. So I've worked with families where, for example, with the previous step plan, the first step might be to draw a picture of a spider, and they might use googly eyes or pipe cleaners to do that. So really thinking about how you can make that fun and engaging and incorporate your child's kind of hobbies and interests. And the tools that I've gone through so far this evening, so talking about worry and the step-by-step plans, are all taken from the book that you can see on the screen here. And there is a version available on audio or Audible as well, if that was something that you wanted to find more information about. There is also a chapter in there specifically for teachers as well, supporting young people with anxiety. And just to note as well, if you are a teacher thinking about how to help a young person with a step plan, it can be helpful to involve the parent and vice versa as well. So if you're a parent building a step plan with your child that involves school, discussing that with the teacher can be a really helpful way to facilitate that plan. Okay, so we've got our final slide for this evening. So Charlotte, are you able to launch my final poll for me, please? So the last poll is that treatment for child anxiety only works when delivered face-to-face. Are we thinking that's a myth, fact, or we're not sure? So again, I'll just give you a few seconds if you'd like to participate in that poll. Okay, that's great. Okay, so again, mainly myth, few people unsure. Again, this is a myth. I think sort of before the pandemic, research was starting to look into different modalities of delivering treatment for children and adolescents with anxiety, but it's really kind of been accelerated with the pandemic. And so what is the evidence base then for treatments that are delivered in different modalities compared to face-to-face? So some of the parent-led CBT interventions that I spoke about earlier, research has shown that they are effective when delivered with telephone support from a therapist. They work better when they have some level of therapist input. My colleagues at the University of Reading and the University of Oxford have recently developed an online parent-led treatment for children with anxiety, where parents work through online information about what anxiety is, how to talk to their child about anxiety. And we've recently published a paper which has shown really promising outcomes for this online treatment with brief telephone calls from a therapist. In terms of child-focused treatments, there's research which has shown really promising outcomes for online and computer-assisted therapy for children and adolescents, which has also been shown to be equivalent to face-to-face outcomes. There's also been recent interest in terms of virtual reality and whether that could be sort of a modality for helping children and young people with anxiety. At the moment, most of the research in terms of virtual reality has been done with adults with anxiety disorders, specifically phobias. There has been much less research done with children and adolescents, so it's a really emerging field, and currently there needs to be much more research before we can draw any kind of firm conclusions about whether that's an effective modality. But definitely thinking about online, telephone interventions are just as effective as face-to-face support. So to kind of summarise the sort of key learning from the myths this evening is that cognitive behavioural therapy is an effective recommended psychological treatment for children and adolescents with anxiety disorders. Parents and teachers are well placed to support anxious children, and they can do so by using open, curious questions to talk about fears and worries, encouraging children to have a go and start to face their fears. And that's often best done in a gradual step-by-step approach, which really focuses on helping children to learn new information about their fears and their ability to cope in feared situations. And so that's all from me in terms of content. So I'll stop sharing my screen now so that we can go through any questions that there might be.
Thanks so much for that, Chloe. First question is, how do you cope when your internet fails and you're completely anxious and worried? Thank you so much for my colleague there, Charlotte, and everyone there. So do keep those kind of questions flying in. So could you just talk a little bit about comorbidity and anxiety? I've got a question here, particularly relating to depression.
Yeah, so we do know that anxiety is highly comorbid, and for those that aren't sure what comorbidity means, it's where a young person might have more than one disorder. So yeah, anxiety disorders are highly comorbid, typically with other anxiety disorders across the age range from pre-adolescence to adolescence. In terms of low mood or depression, that's more commonly comorbid in the sort of adolescent years.
Fantastic. Is there any advice on how to support children with language difficulties, both in understanding the questions and also being able to respond to those?
Yeah, in terms of kind of, understanding the questions, I guess it depends on what their ability is and what sort of the age range is. I mean, it might be like really trying to break those questions down, or it might be trying to ask the question in a different way, or maybe sort of using visual aids or examples. So sometimes with younger children, you might say, oh, Teddy might be worried about X, Y, and Z. Is that what you're worried about? So trying to sort of make it nice and simple, bring in their hobbies and interests if you can.
So leading on from that, would there be any advantage in talking to your child by explaining your own anxieties, either now or when you were a child?
Yeah, definitely. I think it can be really normalizing. So it can help children to feel like they're not the only child in the world who experiences worry. I think often children might think that. So yeah, to share something that you worried about when you were a child, like you said, or even if there's something that you're worrying about coming up at work, you might say, oh, I've got a presentation coming up at work soon. I feel really worried about it. And then reviewing afterwards with your child, how did you find that? How did that presentation at work go? So yeah, it's absolutely fine to kind of normalize worry, appropriate worries to share with children.
So we've got a couple of questions that are relating to autism. So the first one is, do you have any thoughts on adapting CBT for those children with autism?
Yeah, I think the question around autism is really important. We know that autism and anxiety often, again, go hand in hand. And we know that CBT is still an effective treatment for children who have autism and anxiety. Often treatment does have modifications, like you mentioned. I personally haven't worked with children who are also autistic, but there are various different modifications in the literature. So it might be using visual aids or very kind of concrete examples. Also involving parents more in treatment can be particularly helpful, or also as well perhaps involving their sort of special interests can be helpful for engaging.
So it might be a little bit early in terms of research here, but given the pandemic where many people were off school, was there or has there been a rising anxiety with those children that were school refusers, either before the pandemic or after the pandemic?
I'm not entirely sure in terms of school refusers. I think children responded quite differently to the pandemic. Some children's anxiety sort of really reduced when the pandemic first started, because a lot of those kind of anxiety provoking situations were kind of taken away from them, so they didn't have to go to school and things like that. So children tended to respond differently at different times. Some of my colleagues at the University of Oxford have been tracking children's anxiety, behavioural problems since the start of the pandemic, and they've been producing kind of monthly reports on how children have been faring. So I can find the link to that if that would be of interest for those particular people.
So there are a couple of questions relating to self-harm here, and how is it possible to help or give advice for a parent whose child is either self-harming or considering thinking about self-harming?
I think that's a really difficult one, especially as a parent, to know kind of how to manage that situation. I think, as with all kind of mental health problems, it can be helpful to let your child know that you're there if they want to talk to you, or if they want to share, or to let them know what their worries are. I think as well, perhaps maybe getting some professional support or input at that stage, whether that be speaking with school or perhaps other mental health professionals, but maybe involving your child in that process, so that they can come up with ideas with you about how to manage that.
Thank you. It's obviously a very sensitive subject as well. There are kind of a series of questions kind of flowing in around about sleep and sleep patterns, and the idea that not being able to sleep actually increases anxiety, which increases the difficulty to sleep. Are there any kind of interventions or advice that you could give for parents?
Yeah, so again, cognitive behavioural therapy is effective for individuals with sleep difficulties. So there's different kind of components within that. One is about having the right sleep environment. So considering kind of what you're doing in the day. So even from the moment you wake up, so waking up and making sure you're sort of drawing the curtains, letting the natural light in. Exercise and gentle exercise can be really helpful for sleep. Also kind of perhaps monitoring kind of caffeine intake as well, sort of later on in the afternoon, evening, in terms of helping to set up that right environment for sleep. Another thing which can be helpful is that really the bed and sleep should only be associated for sleeping, the bedroom. So if you're kind of doing homework in your bedroom or other activities, that might be associated with being sort of awake and alert. So really thinking about what you're using the bedroom for. And if you are struggling to sleep, sometimes it can be really helpful to get out of bed and go and do something else in a separate room, and then not return to bed until you are sleepy. Often if we're led there kind of worrying and feeling anxious and being annoyed because we can't get to sleep, that can kind of exacerbate the situation.
So this is probably a $64 million kind of question here. It's around identifying anxiety if there doesn't actually appear to be any pattern about what makes people anxious. How do you kind of resolve something like that?
So you mean if they're sort of showing symptoms of anxiety, but they're not sure what is causing the anxiety?
Yeah, almost an irregular pattern, you know, it might come, it might go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think anxiety sort of varies in how it presents. It isn't always necessarily sort of an external trigger. It might be something within yourself. It might be you feel sort of your heart miss a beat or something feel weird in your body, and that can kind of trigger anxiety. So I think, like I mentioned earlier, anxiety is a normal emotion. We're all going to feel anxious from time to time. And so it's starting to identify if these kind of, not necessarily patterns of anxiety, but these episodes of anxiety are starting to really interfere in the young person's life. So looking out for those signs that, it's interfering with school, home, sleep or hobbies. And that's kind of at the point that perhaps maybe this is more than sort of a normal level of anxiety and might benefit from some further input.
I think you mentioned in your talk about the importance of talking. We've got some questions here around the topic of selective mutism and how talking is obviously difficult or not possible for children with selective mutism. Are there any advice or tools or different tips other than talking that you think you could suggest?
Yeah, and that's, again, a really interesting area. One of my colleagues is currently looking into parent-led support for children with selective mutism and anxiety. It's not something that I would particularly specialise in, but I think it's thinking about other methods of communication. So again, is it that they can sort of draw something or write something, or is it how do they normally communicate, and kind of capitalising on that? So I think really parents and teachers are going to be the experts in that situation. They know how they communicate with their child currently, and really kind of using those methods to do that.
So we've got a question that's come through via the chat about the idea of an emotions diary. And I was just wondering if you could explain to the people what an emotions diary is and how that could assist.
So again, I've not ever used sort of an emotions diary, but I would imagine it's where a young person is kind of tracking how they're feeling, perhaps on a daily basis or multiple times throughout the day. Yeah, to kind of keep an eye on their mood and perhaps any particular triggers. Maybe it might be helpful in the instance you were talking about, Matt, if there doesn't seem to be a trigger, maybe that might be a helpful way of kind of noticing, actually, is there a particular time of the day or something I've got coming up at school that might be triggering that.
Cool. I'm just going to ask Charlotte, there's quite a few questions, Charlotte, coming in about school refusal. I was wondering if you could find the campfire session that we did in December about that and post that. So just going on again about school refusal and anxiety, a lot of questions coming in that children are finding it difficult to even comprehend the concept of going to school. Should there be like a baby step approach, or can you get the school involved in some way?
Definitely. I think maybe it's sort of a combination of both. I think definitely at that point, even if it's difficult to comprehend the idea of school, that hopefully the school would already be kind of aware or on board, thinking about what kind of support mechanisms they've got in place to help encourage the child back into school. And perhaps, doing that in a graded step-by-step way would be helpful.
So again, we're going to return to autism here and the idea of facing a fear with particularly around heightened sensitivities to sound and light. Difficult question. How would you kind of approach that situation where perhaps you would kind of talk through, but it might not be the best option for these type of children, neurodiverse children?
So in terms of kind of the talking about it being difficult, or the step?
Yes, so the idea that this particular question is relating to especially loud noises, and the idea that you gave the example of the spider, how would that, would that be possible?
Yeah, I think, again, it would be thinking about identifying, like with the young person, are there certain noises that are worse than others? So is it like the hairdryer is the worst thing, or is it that it's the vacuum cleaner, and then perhaps maybe building a hierarchy, again, with the easier noises first, and then working their way up.
So we've got a really interesting question here around meltdowns, and this one relates to bedroom and sleep. And this particular child is finding it so difficult to go back into the bedroom because of the memories that generates and the anxiety that then there brings. How would something like that kind of play out in terms of intervention?
So they're struggling to go into the bedroom because they've previously had a meltdown. I think that's a bit of a tricky one. It sounds like they've sort of associated the bedroom with sort of being a negative place. What was the meltdown about, did you say?
I think it's because they find it hard to sleep in their room because of particular memories associated with that, and the idea of how to get the child back into the room to get back into a sleeping pattern.
Yeah, again, I think it's about maybe exploring with the child, like what is the worry there? What was the memory? What is it that's anxiety provoking about that? To really nail down what is the worry, and then can we kind of work with that worry? So thinking about breaking that down and making it more manageable for the young person.
Excellent. So interesting one here about panic attacks. Could you actually explain the difference between panic attacks and anxiety? how those can be noticed, what are the trigger signs, and how you could alleviate that?
So panic attacks are often a very sudden onset of anxiety. So they typically kind of peak within 10 minutes. And they're associated with kind of a real range of physical symptoms. So it might be heart beating really fast, difficulty or very fast breathing, feeling very sweaty, or perhaps tingling or numb. There's a whole real range of physical sensations. Cognitively, the young person might be worried that they're going to have a heart attack, or they're going to faint, or perhaps pass out. So it can be a really, really intense period of anxiety, which can be really hard for a young person if they're experiencing a panic attack. And they often come out of the blue. So things that can be helpful sort of in the midst of a panic attack might be to focus on things sort of in the environment around them. So try and spot 5 things around them that are red, or 4 things around them that they can touch. So really kind of trying to sort of ground them using their senses. So things they can see, touch, smell, perhaps taste, can be helpful to sort of bring them back down in that moment.
So obviously there isn't a catch-all, that, you know, there isn't just one type of intervention that suits all. Some might be face-to-face, some might be online. Got a question here relating to if CBT isn't working, would something like medication potentially help?
Yeah, so there is some evidence that medication is effective, at least in the short term, for children and adolescents who are experiencing anxiety. Particularly the group of kind of medication that is often sort of thought of is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. They're not often kind of used as a first line intervention because there's not been much research looking at sort of the long-term effects on children and sort of the developing brain. So that is something that can be considered, but it's often not done as the first step. So often it would be cognitive behavioural therapy first. So in that instance, it sounds like they're already being supported. So I would probably speak with their therapist or doctor about if there's any other appropriate treatments that might be helpful.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Chloe. So we're at 5:45 now, so we're going to bring the session to a close.
Find out more about becoming an ACAM member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health. Visit www.acamh.org.